Hello. Well, I think it's the last talk for today before there's like some epic boat ride I've heard, which sounds thrilling. So thanks for coming to my talk. This is a talk that I started putting together. You know well, maybe maybe you don't know, but the way you submit talks to things, you have to submit them 9 to 18 months ahead of time. And so when this talk was coming about, it was about last fall or so. And there was a big, as I'll get into, there was a big discussion about developer productivity metrics and things like that. And it was quite interesting, which I'll recant a little, not recant. I think that's if you were to pour wine back into a bottle, but which I'll go over again. And I think it's been nice to kind of review that stuff and bring it up to date of what's been going on. So we'll get into it now. Oftentimes, especially when I'm talking to a crowd like yourselves, there's a way of giving a presentation, going over a talk where you kind of slowly build up from principles. And you lay out the problem and you establish things. And then eventually at the end, if you've timed yourself well, you actually get to the answers that people wanted at the beginning. And with something like developer productivity, probably what you want to know is just tell me which metrics to do so I can leave. I want to take a nap before that boat. And so I'll go over that, and then we'll go into all the rest of it. So sort of, I think, the state of the art of what developer productivity metrics there's a series of articles kind of from the Dr. Nicole, who worked on the Dora metrics for a while, and a lot of other people have joined into it from Microsoft and this DX startup. But the most recent, I think, PDF, let's call it that, analysis research is in this triangle here. And my summary of it, I don't mean it to be too summarized, as it were, but a lot of what it's talking about when it comes to developer productivity, to metrics, is that you want to measure, I would say, the happiness of the developers, the flow state that they're in. Not necessarily, I mean, obviously, we're all people, and this is like 2024. We know lines of code is not good, and all of those things from the whatever those NATO papers were back in the 60s. But like, there's still all sorts of other metrics, measurements that people would focus on. But as you can kind of see in this triangle, the things you're measuring and what you're trying to solve, there's a strong sort of ongoing theory that if you ensure those points of the triangle, then the developers will be productive and you'll get what you want going on. So I think this is I've read this paper 3-4 times, which either means I'm slow or I really liked it, or both. Probably both and other things. But it's a great, if you really just want the answers, I would go check this out. And there's a few other things that I'll go over as well, but that's the first answer. Now, the second one, kind of the let's call it the theory. I want to develop here, or a hypothesis. I don't know. I got a philosophy degree, so those are the scientific terms I'm not familiar with. But is that at first thought, when we talk about developer productivity, because it's in the name, we spend a lot of time focusing on developers and what they're doing, right? How to make them more productive. But as I've looked at this over the years, when I was a developer and now looking at the literature and talking with people, it seems like a lot of the gains in developer productivity come from things developers aren't actually involved in, right? So this is a distinction all of us in this field were very interested in several years ago: the inner loop and the outer loop. And the inner loop, basically stuff developers do; outer loop, stuff they kind of don't do. And by developers, I mean application developers. And as we'll get into, when you look at speeding up, let's call it the software delivery process, or as we in marketing would say, the software lifecycle. What you see is a lot of the ways to improve are in that outer loop. And that indeed, I think, becomes the primary focus at the moment of how you can gain developer productivity, how you can speed things up, rather than just looking at the developers themselves. So first of all, that was the summary. You can feel free to leave now, because that's going to be the conclusion that I reach. If you're interested in how we get there, please stay for the rest. But this is me, as you can see there. I used to wear that shirt all the time when I present, but my dog got nervous one day when we left it at home and she ripped it up, which is unfortunate. I don't know why I mentioned that other than I'm very sad. But I used to be, as mentioned, a software developer a long time ago. Then I was an industry analyst at this place called Red Monk. And then I've done all sorts of other things. I actually worked in corporate strategy and M&A for a little bit. I'm originally from Austin, so if you live in Austin and you work in tech, you have to do a 2-year compulsory service for Dell, even though they're technically in Round Rock, but no one really pays attention to that. And now I've been, some time ago, I joined Pivotal, which was then acquired by VMware, which was then acquired by Broadcom, and now we are VMware Tanzu by Broadcom. But through this almost 10 years, I've been really lucky to be on the developer advocate team. And my focus is mostly on organizational questions like developer productivity. How do we arrange our organization? How do we put platforms in place? How do we manage the way that we're doing software? How do we just get better at software? And I've been able to write several books during that. And I also do some podcasts, both serious and ridiculous, if you're into those kind of things. But that's me and the sad story about my favorite shirt. We'll get on to it. So, like I was saying, when I was thinking about these topics, it was about last fall, and this is when this report came out. And boy, was it in the fall? That's a good narrative. But like, I actually put the date down there so I could check. Yes, August. That's fall, right? So it's pretty much a year ago, and this created a huge nerd fight, if you remember. It was fantastic. Like, I don't know if the McKinsey people ever responded, but the best, most better nerd fight that had happened, if you remember back in the Devops days, Gartner had this thing called bimodal IT, and that was just the nerd fight that kept giving. You can go look that up. But this is equivalent. It's kind of like a demigod to the god of the bimodal IT fight. And what was going on here when it comes to developer productivity is, McKinsey, which I used to work in corporate strategy, so sure. An outside organization that you invite in, kind of like a vampire, to optimize your organization and give you some third-party advice about how to improve things and make them better. And what they were trying to do with this PDF, which is a laudable goal. And as I go over some of the more cynical things about developer productivity, just imagine a role that isn't developers, like bakery productivity, or plumber productivity, or a person that keeps going over schedule and over budget to do my home renovations productivity, right? And think about how people would have these motivations to measure developer productivity. So what they were trying to do here, as they kind of got to, is they wanted to finally solve this problem of how we measure individual developers' productivity. I don't know if they would exactly summarize it that way, but when you look at the metrics, which I've highlighted, except for quality documentation, which is from another school of metricy-ness, but if you look at most of those metrics, they're all about tracking and measuring an individual, right? Not a team, but they essentially want to, as you would from a management consulting firm who's brought in to optimize how you're running, they want to figure out, do I need to pay for this person over here, right? And like, how would I even determine that? They keep telling me lines of code is not important and that I can't measure, for stack ranking is bad. And like, how do I even measure these people, right? Like, how do I know that something is happening here? And so that's what this report was finally trying to solve. As you can see, it's, it doesn't have to be that way. Now, of course, I think most people here are of a developer mindset. Who likes to be measured? No one, right? Like, you don't really want to share measurements with the same people who determines which numbers are on your paycheck. It's not a good situation, right? Like, as we'll get into, that usually doesn't turn out well in the less than optimistic case. So that creates, I think, this interest in developer productivity at the moment. It's kind of a sign of an interest in that. And then I think the second, even more up-to-date reason why developer productivity is important is our old friend here, AI, right? Now, there were a bunch of great smaller sessions before this, and several of them about AI, which were fun to walk through. But, the discussion around AI, right, when it comes to developers is essentially, one of like, do I need to pay for that person over there, right? It's sort of like, how can we replace developers or augment them, kind of improve and make them more productive with this sort of code, because they should be more productive, right? Right. So we should be focusing on like making each individual in our overall factory, a word developers love to think of themselves working in our overall factory of production, right? And indeed, you see this. This is from 2023. I somehow dropped the citation, which is going to be irksome for a long time. But you can see that there's an IDC estimate about the percentage of sort of generative AI being used in application development. And again, this is from like 2023. So you can just imagine in 2025, this number will, let's say, it will go up in optimistic application, which is to say, who knows if it'll work, but it'll certainly be doing a lot of figuring out if it works, right? So we've got a whole, like, sort of a couple of years, or at least 1 year, depending on how things go, of like really focusing on what developer productivity is and obsessing about it and hoping, well, depending on the role you're in, hoping that there's a way of improving it that is relatively free, right? Extremely cheap, that you can apply for. Now, my advice over the years, both to myself and developers in general, and just maybe as a piece of I don't know, I'll be aggrandizing wisdom to impart to everyone, is whatever job you have, if you're in a situation where someone says that job can be done more easily, or now we can be more productive in that job, you should try to dissuade them of that as much as possible. Because what you want people to think about your job is that it's very difficult, it's rare to find the talent in it, it's very complex, and it takes a lot of skill to do it. And that's just sort of basic supply and demand, right? And so if you are the developers who are developing a way to replace developers, it's, you should think about that a little bit, right? Like think about, do I actually want to simplify the perception, whether it's real or not, of the job that I do? Should it be something that's easy to perform, right? So just, keep that in mind as you do your generative AI replacing yourself pilot projects and things like that. So what is developer productivity? I think it's worthwhile asking that because it's, there's basic assumptions you would have about what it is. I mean, I think productivity as a whole is, do we like the number when we say the outcome that we got, the money that we sold something for versus the cost of the good and the cost of selling it, right? We want that profit margin to be as wide as possible. And you can think of that in terms of effort or efficiency, all sorts of things like that. But when it comes to like developer productivity of software, but it's historically been very difficult to measure when it comes to software. There's so many different little things running around, how you would draw a direct connection between, the typing that a developer has and then the outcome, the success that the business has, linking that together. And then, of course, there's always the I was thinking of have y'all seen that most recent Wes Anderson movie, The French Dispatch? And they go over the magazine writers in this fictional magazine, and there's one of them who's always just eating an apple standing in the hallway that seems to have never written an article. And with developers, the joke is always like, well, that's the reason. That's the most productive person here, right? Like they're a catalyst for other people and they help influence them and they drive decisions even though they very often don't commit something. So you can see that tracking down who's responsible for what, let alone that you're going to report up to people, becomes very difficult over time. And in general, it's exactly to the reason that McKinsey PDF came out. It's believed that it's impossible to accurately track developer productivity. And so this creates quite the issue, right? Now, as I went over, this is back from the exciting discussion about this last fall. So this was Kent Beck and friends. We're kind of going over like, all right, let's talk about someone's come on the scene and they're going to measure us developers. So let's get this figured out, right? And so you've got a basic idea of how you figure out productivity. And having worked in marketing for many years, this is like this word right here, outcome and impact. Oh, we love that. People who spend a lot of money on software, they love those two things. But this is a basic sort of cycle of what you want for productivity, right? Like the amount we put in, the output done, but most importantly, like it's mattering, like its value, the impact that it has, right? You could be very productive developing all sorts of software, and it doesn't really do anything. It has no impact. It doesn't move the needle, as they used to say. And so, is a productive developer whose software is never used productive? Like it's a fun, maybe not fun, but it's a question to ponder. And then so further on, if you read this, is a great two-part reply. I think the reply that Kent Beck and Gregory had there was maybe longer than the original PDF. But you look at this. This is kind of like a basic idea of the developer in the cycle, right? So it's the essential idea of like I think of something, or one thinks of an idea, something that we want to do in software. Usually there's software involved when there's a software developer. And we kind of like figure out how to code it. Depending on what methodology you use, there's all sorts of things going on here, but we do the code, we get it in front of people. We somehow figure out if the people using the software, here it's a for-profit situation, so you have customers, not citizens or whatever. But do they actually do something differently? As a side note, is that good or bad, right? But you want to measure that there's an impact. There's actually an effect. And then that goes down to whatever your organization wants. So did we make more money, or did we reduce like wait times for passport renewals, whatever sort of metric that you have to measure it, right? So this all makes sense, I think, for like what developer productivity would be. And, again, the question is like, so why is this so hard to measure? And I think maybe it's apparent, like one of the major reasons over time that I've when I talk with organizations why it's so difficult to measure is largely in these two last boxes, right? Like one, tracking how your users are using your software and rating if it's good or bad is not always done very widely. And then also, depending on what type of organization you work in, if you work at if you work at a tech company, oftentimes you don't have all of these problems. But if you work at like a bank or a manufacturer or a government ministry or agency, like just getting this last arrow to know that the software you're using actually connects to some change is very difficult usually for multiple reasons. So now let's move into like why you would want to measure developer productivity. And I think there's why answers, but it's also important whenever you're looking at something like developer productivity, not only asking why, but who's asking, because that's your second level of why, if you will. Like, why would they be interested? Now, the the first reason, we all want to be good craftspeople and enjoy our code, get some sort of life-fulfilling good vibes out of doing a good job. You want to improve, right? Like, so forth and so on, right? So for a long time, let's say internally in the software developer world, there's this notion that if you track what you're doing over time, it's a way that you can help improve, right? I mean, this is just like any sort of health or improvement thing. Usually it's good to have a way of measuring over time if things that you're doing are making it better or worse. So, it's good to track developer productivity for your own sake. Like, did I do anything this week? Which, depending on your take on the whole, management worker situation, if the answer is no, I did nothing, but I still got paid, that might be 100% productivity versus the other way around. But that's definitely something that is worth considering when it comes to developer productivity is how do I use it and how do we use it as developers to improve the way that we're doing things. But in general, I find that when people are talking about developer productivity, it's usually this person. They're the ones who are more interested in what developer productivity is and like what they're going to do with it. Like whether or not you improve as a developer, maybe I could get someone else who's more improved. Like it's not quite like a concern of the internal facing stuff. Similarly, like whether that person can reduce their cell phone bills is probably not your concern either, right? Like whatever it is they're doing is their responsibility. It's not really like part of the end-to-end process you have to work with nice haircut guy there, also very shiny teeth. So when those people are talking about developer productivity, I think there's two things they're focused on. One is basically the money side of things, and again, depending on if you're like in a for-profit or a non-profit situation, like things are a little fluid, but generally it's like the resources that we're focused on, right? And I've already kind of joked about this a little bit, but you're very interested in like, are we paying too much for the developers, right? Compared to other organizations and benchmarks, or just compared to the output that they're giving us, right? Like, and and once we know that analysis, could we pay less, right? Could we spend less resources on it? And then there's also, and this could be a good part or a bad part, is like you kind of sort of need to know like who to give a raise and give bonuses to and who to get rid of, right? Like how do you even evaluate like who gets the promotion versus who doesn't? And meanwhile, the developer teams are like, you can't think about individuals. It's all about the team and things like that. So in this situation, people in the in management layers like are looking to accomplish these sorts of things. Now, the other reason, a more maybe less cynical, more positive reason of thinking about developer productivity is this is a good situation. There's a great chapter in the, well, I'm sure there's many great chapters, but one chapter I read, which was great, in the, I think it's like the Google software engineering book, going over measuring developer productivity and metrics. And there's a point made there, which I think it's easy to overlook, which is I need to know what my developer productivity is because if business is going great or whatever, will it be the case that if I get more developers, I'm going to get more money, get more business, right? Like, should I be investing in my developer capability? And also, like, just because I hire 5,000 more developers doesn't mean that's going to work, right? Like, where's the chart of how I scale up developers that I have in order to add new business capabilities or add new features or go into new markets or things like that? And having an understanding of like developer productivity doesn't really solve for all of that, but it does give you good inputs, as they would say, on doing that kind of analysis. The rate at which you add new capacity, that you add new development for doing things. Now, I keep distinguishing between for-profit and nonprofit, and there's an interesting quandary for a developer to have here, which I have no answer from. Is like, what do you do if you're in an organization that doesn't really care about growth, which might be a large commercial organization that doesn't really need to worry about competing or growing, like a lot of banks. Or it could be in a government agency where like growth is also not that big of a deal, right? I mean, I'm over exaggerating it, but there's different sort of concerns about like you don't necessarily worry about growth in those situations as much as you might in others. And how does that trickle down to what developer productivity is? Which, like I said, I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but it's fun to think on. So with those motivations of why you would want to think about developer productivity, let's take a look at the buffet of metrics out there, which I already covered earlier, so I could skip over these, but we'll spend some more time on them, a little more detail. There's three things that you'll encounter in developer productivity nowadays, and the first one, of course, is the DevOps, everyone's favorite DevOps metrics, DORA, right? And here, these are old enough metrics. They're still good, but they're old enough metrics that they don't quite fit with the current, like, I don't know, approach that with developer productivity you don't measure activity and instead you measure, and again I'm making fun of it just to make fun of it, but you don't measure the feelings so much, right? You're not measuring kind of like the environment and the context and the people. You're measuring activity, and these measurements of activity will indicate that you're being productive, and they also become a target of a way of measure of things to achieve, right? So, a lot of these are basically like the speed at which you can get software out, the speed at which you can fix things, and then also measuring like how much your change failure rate, right? So these are like, first of all, what's interesting about these metrics is we've had them for a long time, and I think people still struggle to kind of apply them universally, right? Apply them at scale. So as you look through these metrics, it's also interesting to ask, like, do we use these metrics? How would we measure these metrics in my application or like 500 applications? How would we gather these things? And then after this, from the same kind of school of people, the same line. Out of looking at Microsoft and I forget if it has the GitHub stuff in there as well. But there's this thing called the space metrics, and here you can see this almost like mixing together of activity metrics, and then also sort of like feeling metrics, like humane metrics around things, right? So you mix these two things together, and they're things that you measure, but they're also indicators of like the health of the organization that you have. And then, as I got into, this is the current one that we have, right? And I think there's a few like interesting things going on with this, as I talked about earlier. One is like um, this framework is, at least to my eyes, a lot more prescriptive than a lot of developer productivity or operation metrics have been in the past, right? Like, so if you think about the DORA metrics, they're kind of like an end goal that you want to get to, right? It's just like however you might increase, or I guess you want to decrease your change failure rate, or however you may increase or again decrease your lead time, increase your ability to deploy quickly. Like the metrics don't really tell you that, right? But here you can kind of see the metrics are saying like do this, right? Like focus on these sorts of things, right? Reducing, as people like to say, the cognitive load. So the amount of time it takes to figure things out, and focusing on kind of like the perceptions, the satisfaction developers have with the activities that they're doing. And then there's also things of just like measuring the time that it takes to do things and so forth and so on. But what's really interesting about this is when you read through it, it's one of the only sort of discussions of developer productivity or just development that's trying to capture what flow state means and how to achieve it, right? And this has been like important for as long as I've known about software development, and it's basically like don't interrupt me, right? Is like the main quantifiable thing for flow state there, and it's it's hard to explain that to people based on how much people are still interrupted. And you even make fun of the people who will have a I'm busy hat, and they'll put their hat on, and you're not supposed to go talk to them, which seems ridiculous. But what are you going to do? People keep interrupting you, and so like that is an aspect that I think is very very helpful here. Is like moving that flow state, that don't interrupt me, let me take the time to ramp up to be really into thinking about what I'm doing, kind of like almost mystically connected to coding. And then once you like interrupt me, I'm pulled out of that. Like I'm pulled out of some sort of like, fun fantasy world. And it's going to take me a long time to discover all the incantations to enter it again. Right. And if that happens enough times during the day, then you don't really get that much done. Which is very unsatisfying. So, like I said at the beginning, these are great metrics to kind of start looking at and thinking about how you're applying them to increasing your developer productivity. Now, there's another one that I think is I like this notion from very recently. I guess this is June, so May was last month. From this guy James Shore. And I don't know. I don't think he's got a PDF, or I don't think he's written something for the American Computing Machinery magazines or whatever. But this approach is kind of a model of thinking that I think is good if you're worried about how am I going to explain this to the bosses, right? And this is a situation, one of the things that comes up a lot, conversations I have is like, all of that sounds great, but now I go back and I've got to like convince my managers that we should do anything about it. And I tell them a very compelling case. I'm all like mystic flow state. And then they're like, yeah, but whatever, right? And so you need some way of like speaking their language and communicating with them. And this is especially true when it comes to like legacy modernization, tech debt, things like that, right? Like, why are we running a version of our framework that's like 10 years old, right? Like, intuitively, that's terrible. And I could tell you, not I, but this fictional person over here, they could tell their boss why that's bad. They tell their boss, and their boss is like, yeah, but maybe we should just add features to the software instead, right? And so here is one, like we're all constantly on the search for ways of explaining to non-developers developer concerns. And this is an interesting one that's quantifiable, is to think, so we've got three activities we can kind of spend that when we're doing our development work. One, we can add new features, right? Which is what people generally want. Two, we've got this kind of like, I think I made up this phrase, but we've got this sort of hygiene. Like we've got to do code reviews, and we should review the architecture. Like we should probably have version control, and like these things that are like people accept that we need to like keep our tools clean and whatnot, right? But then this last part is what people in large organizations tend to spend most of their time on, which is maintenance, which is just like dealing with all the stuff we have and producing nothing new, right? Like whether that's dealing with bugs that you have, checking on new sort of like compliance needs that you have, just figuring stuff out, like when you do need to add a new feature, whatever it may be, right? And so tracking these three activities, I don't know if it's proven out because it was just written here in May, but I think it matches with approaches that you use in other sort of like managing upward situations where you need a way of quantifying and explaining a very esoteric concept to a non-expert, right? It's kind of like if you've ever like talked with a corporate strategy person and they try to explain like what internal rate of return is, and you're just like that sounds crazy. Like it's equivalent sort of thing that like some lore that you've got to communicate to them. So if you reduce down the time you spend on these three things and you present that to management, what you can allow them to kind of see is that like we're not very productive if we're spending a lot of our time on maintenance, right? Now, how we might solve that is a whole other discussion, but at least we gather the interest that we should spend time worrying about maintenance instead of only thinking about features. You can see that we have a productivity problem. This is like the way we spend our time is not effective. So maybe you should give us a few release cycles to address those issues there. So then finally, let's go into a section. As I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of what actually improves developer productivity nowadays comes down to things that are sort of outside of that loop, right? Things that happen outside of actually coding, and maybe even beyond the developer's laptop or whatever. And I think that comes down, I think, to like tools that are used. And so the first one is to kind of start pinpointing where your developer productivity problems are and how you might address them. I think a common tool to use is the age-old technique of ask them, right? Which is to say a survey. And this is a survey that we at used to be called Pivotal Labs and now Tanzu Labs, but one of the surveys that we use for this kind of diagnosticness. And I worked with them a couple years ago to like we have I think a CSV file somewhere you can import this into your survey tool, but whatever, you can kind of read through here, and what you're doing is you're looking through the activities that a developer does, the tools that they use, and even their that kind of more human stuff, their perceptions of the organization they work in. That kind of maps, some of these things map to those various items on the metrics buffet. And you're going and you're just asking them to rate what they think about this, right? And I guess this is a type of metric in itself, is if you think about doing this initially, this will give you a baseline of what's going on in that mysterious opaque box of developer productivity, because you'll get some answers here. And however you want to do the survey, you have them answer like on whether it's on a Likert scale or whatever, a 1 to 5 scale, or I forget the other scale. I encountered this the other day. That's 0 to 2 and 0 to -2. Which is always fun to play with negative numbers. That's like when people express percentages as 0 point something, and it's just like, I don't know, just put a percentage sign in there for us liberal arts people. This is overly complicated. And so you can measure it however you want. So you do that initial measurement, right? And then applying sort of like, basic agile design, kind of lean thinking. You then want to try to improve it, make some changes based on what the answers are. And then, for example, you might import this and find like the top 3 things that the developers in aggregate are complaining about. And if they're not ridiculous, then you probably know some things to fix, right? Like it's something that you can address. And importantly, you fix it. If you remember all the way back to the loop, it's always important to observe if your customers behave differently. and then actually see if that was valuable or not, right? And so the way you can do that, other than like, going out to those luxurious, 2-hour developer lunches that I miss so much that we used to have, is you send the survey out again, right? And you see if the numbers have moved in a good or a bad direction, right? And if basically the answers are the same, that means what you're trying to do didn't work in general, or there's some big conspiracy against you, which might actually be an even more fun result, because that's how exciting would that be if the developers got together and had a conspiracy inside your organization for whatever. Like, I'm getting a little too excited about that. That's like some premiere TV episode. Anyhow, so there's one way of doing it. And like I said, there's all sorts of surveys out there and things that you can do, but I think that is something that's not really done as much as it could. Now, the next thing that I like going over quite a bit, because I feel like it's important and astounding, is essentially like build automation. I mean, we all know what build automation is, and continuous integration, and I've long ago forgotten the nuance between delivery and deployment, so I'll just say delivery. But like, like what's the difference between lead time and cycle time? I don't know. It sounds like a bunch of like intricate whatever. So do you actually have this sort of thing in place, right? Because I think over the years, if you do an analysis of all the activities it takes, again, think back to that cycle of like, I've got an idea, or someone has an idea of what some code we should have, right? Like, what if we moved this box over here? And then like, what are all the activity it takes to get that I'm doing air quotes here, line of code into production, right? And I think we've been pretty good over the years that if you map out this activity, that in each of these boxes, people are pretty optimized and they're kind of doing the best they can with what they have, right? They're doing pretty well. But what you find when you map this out is that it's the stuff outside of the boxes that creates all sorts of problems, right? And it's more than just like handoffs and waiting for meetings, right? Especially this time of year. I've lived up in Amsterdam for about 6 years, and I know that this time of year, this is about the last time anything productive is going to happen until September, because it's vacation time, which is fantastic. And so, like, it's not only those meetings that you need to schedule and getting with people, but it's also things like, the security people have told us we've got to meet the audit, so now we've got to go back and figure out what we need to do there, right? Or like, have we packaged our stuff correctly? It's all these activities going between the two of them. So if you look at this, I think figuring out how long it takes to go through that whole process is the start of why CI/CD is important, right? And it's more than just automating any one part in there. And this all makes sense. It seems like especially when you consider the history of build automation. Not pictured here, but I think I looked it up, and I think it was in maybe the early '90s when someone else at a talk referenced Grady Booch, which is great. I don't know if he comes up as much as he used to, but in his object orientation book, which I remember, I had to read that once in the '90s, and it felt like some kind of hazing. But he mentioned this idea of you should continuously deploy things, and then of course we had Cruise Control, and then Hudson, and then Oracle, and then Jenkins, and all these sorts of things, right? Like we've had almost, depending on how you count, 20, 30 years or so of like you should automate your builds. Right? And I think most excitingly is this last one where Gary here was like, so get this, I worked on printer firmware at HP, and I know what you're thinking. You can't automate that build. And he's like, let me give you 170 pages on exactly how you can. He's like, took us a year, but we did it. And so like you can basically do build automation. If you can do it over printer firmware, I'm not sure why printers are still so annoying, but like, you can do it anywhere. However, over the years, this has been, as I mentioned, I used to be an industry analyst, so I got really into and working in M&A, so I really got into charts, much more so than when I was a developer, which that would be a fun conversation for some other time. But I used to look at the State of Agile survey, which they had been doing, I think when it was CollabNet, and then like all storied companies, there's sort of a series of big PE fish eating PE fish. and became CollabNet, and then version 1, and then now it's digital.ai, I think. All sorts of great stuff going on there. But they used to do an annual survey, and this is one question where they asked, what is your CI and CD usage? And again, I don't know which D they're talking about there, but whatever. And hopefully what you can see here with the chart is that things haven't been improving that much, right? Like things improved a little bit at first, and then it more or less leveled out. And of course, CD has been going up, but eventually it's I don't really know how you do CD without CI. So at some point, things are going to not work out over here. Now the problem is, they stopped asking this question, and it ends in 2021. So I went hunting around, and I found some more recent stuff. There's the CD Foundation around. I think they're part of the Linux Foundation family of foundations, and they actually have been asking a similar question, or the same question, for several years and quarters here, right? And you can see a similar flatness of respondents saying what they're, I forget the exact wording of the question, it's on there, but it is a little like, if you're really into debating what surveys mean, you can have fun with this one. But it's essentially asking individuals if they are involved in build and test automation and CI/CD things, right? And if you look at the demographics for the survey, I think it's pretty representative of with a survey like this, you don't want it to just be like, all of the tech companies. Like surveying what tech companies do is fun, but it's not helpful for like all the regular companies out there. All of us normal people, not strange tech people. But I think, having looked at the demographics, I think it's pretty representative. So, that kind of gives you a sense of like how there's not as much build automation going on as you would expect. And just to make the point explicit, this is a great thing. If you want to make a point, use a 100% bar chart, something I used in my M&A days. But what you can see here is like, never mind the green, how many people are doing CI, how many people are not doing it, right? And just like playing around with that shows you like a different perspective of like, there's a huge amount of people who aren't automating their build. So like, what are we even talking about with like using AI for code? Like there's some basic things that probably are not being done out there. Now, I'm sure everyone in here is in the green part of that code, and you're doing great. So like now when you go talk with people who aren't here and they're sad, you can empathize with them and tell them like, I understand what your problems are, and maybe even offer them a solution. But, half more seriously, whatever that means, like that's kind of the first thing I would recommend is just like, go back to your organization if you want to. Maybe you figured out a reason not to after the conference here. But when you go back, like figure out like, are we really automating our end-to-end pipeline or build, like, or not? Because like if we are, we're in like a pretty good situation, right? And this is especially something good to ask the management side who hopefully own the responsibility for this type of thing. So then the last thing I want to go over that I think contributes to developer productivity, and again, it's all back to my kind of whatever hypothesis or whatnot, my tentative conclusion or hopeful conclusion that a lot of what improves developer productivity has little to do with what the developer is doing, right? Like that it has a lot more to do with what is done after the developer does something, that outer loop, if you will. And so this is one, given the biases of my employer and what I pay attention to over the years, that I think comes up all the time, which is, and I remember when my friends and I used to do this, is if you're a developer, you really like developing things. Like it's like right in the name there. And so like it's really easy to kind of get into this notion of like, we should build like our own platform that we run our applications on. Now, I know that all I'm doing is I'm working on this form that someone, whenever someone applies for motorcycle insurance, one of our internal people, they use these 3 web pages to basically authorize that we have enough money to insure this person. I know that's super thrilling, and I enjoy every minute that I work on it. But wouldn't it be cool if we actually built the whole platform that our stuff ran on? And this happens over and over again, that you kind of lose track of the thrill of your internal insurance approval process application. And instead, you want to start working on a platform that you have, which generally is not great. Instead, you see people, whether you get a platform from somewhere, out in the clouds, or more of an on-premise sort of thing, or whatever, you end up with a platform pretty much like this. And this is great. This is from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's their reference architecture for what a platform is. And if you're one of these developers who's very bored with your internal motorcycle insurance approval app, here's a blueprint for what you could do in your spare time instead. You could build a platform. And I think it's also good because it allows you to realize that all of this stuff is pretty much what you need to run any application. And it's highly, to use a technical term, undifferentiated. It's a commodity, right? There's not really much advantage you're going to get by spending your time customizing this stuff. And it's outlined quite well there. And now, despite that, kind of like with the CI/CD stuff, this is from a recent survey that we did. We renamed our State of Kubernetes surveys to the State of Cloud Platforms survey, which is great. But you can see that the other problem with building your own platform is you often end up with many platforms, not small, but lots of platforms. And the issue here is that now you've got multiple problems, right? Not only do you have to understand how to use these platforms, but you have to manage them and do that maintenance, right? You have different variability across the platforms and so forth and so on, right? It's similar to from a developer perspective, it's probably a good idea to have a limited amount of ways of doing your UI stuff, or to try to limit the way that you're doing eventing, or to only have maybe one, probably one. I guess there is the ultimate developer productivity is not having to do anything, but to have maybe 2 different ways of doing something, right? You don't want to have 10 different databases that you have to work with just to approve some motorcycle insurance, right? You want to standardize on things. And that same thing applies to platforms. And you can see, and this is anecdotally the case, large organizations have lots and lots of platforms out there. And that's, if you remember back to that triangle of maintenance, that's what a lot of that maintenance at the bottom is dealing with all this variability. And then, this is actually from another survey, the State of Spring, which I know it's a Java world, but whatever. You can see that lots of people are building their own platforms, right? There's a small amount of people who are just using kind of off-the-shelf platforms, and instead they tend to build up from the what would you call it? Atomic units of infrastructure, instead of having a platform on top of it, which is sad, because maybe it's not sad, it's fun, but from a developer productivity standpoint, then your developer productivity is all sunk into either building a platform or dealing with the platform, or as I think this is a misapplication of the term, but as the team topologies people like to say, cognitive load, right? You're adding more cognitive load to understand what's going on here, instead of whatever the opposite of cognitive load is. Intuitive swiftness? I'm not sure. So that's why I generally think about the inner loop stuff is great, right? There's a lot of improvement and things that you can do there, but in general, especially at large organizations, I think if you were to do a 2x2 matrix, which is the only way anything's decided in a large organization, the ease and outcome and result, I think, would point you towards focusing on these outer loop activities, automating your build, reducing down the amount of platforms that you have and standardizing on it. And I think that's likely where you will get the results that you want with developer productivity, which are really more about, like I said, marketing people love this term, application lifecycle productivity, right? You're focusing on the entire end-to-end process and making that as productive as possible, not just locally optimizing on developers, fantastic and vital as they are to the whole process. But paying attention to the whole thing, I think, is much more valuable. So then finally, a lot of the stuff, I think this is the person, his newsletter, he draws from other stuff, but he's the person who is writing the most best stuff about all of this. And, little wonder, he has a startup that sells you developer productivity tools, which is great. I'm sure it's fantastic. But you should definitely check out this newsletter. He has published a lot of the things that I've gone over, and like I look forward to it. I think it's every 2 weeks or whatever. But you'll get a good survey of how people are thinking about developer productivity, all the metrics. It's fantastic. And then finally, if you really are interested in platforms, we have a fantastic pre-shaved yak you should check out that I've worked on over the years. By worked on, I mean talked about. I actually haven't coded since 2005, but there's a lot of great lessons learned from it and things like that. And I think we have some time for questions. I appreciate you being here. And if you don't want to talk now, I'm always happy to talk otherwise, and generally available except when I'm not. So thanks.